But we like, there we go. Got it. There we go. So it's being recorded. It's recorded for a couple of reasons. We could have done this before the pandemic started, but one thing is people often like to download this stuff from the website, of course. And also Josh is giving a talk, and as I understand, it's his first talk as an associate professor here at U of T. And it's not a bad idea to have the talk, and if he wants to delete it, that's up to him. Okay, so it's being recorded. Josh, you make your own call. So just recording aside, ground rules before I say a few things about Josh. During the presentation, please have your camera off and be muted. This is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar. So that means we get to see everybody, which is the way I prefer to do things, because it's nice to see, my friends and colleagues and other people who are popping in. So when we come to the Q&A period, you can go back on camera if you want, you can unmute, it's not terribly necessary. But one thing, because there's a fairly large number of people today, and that's terrific, we have about 30 guests for Josh's lecture. What that means is that we'll have to use the chat box, okay? Because it'll be easier for me to manage and easier for Josh, and Catherine's gonna help me. So when we're into the Q&A, which I think will be about 1:45, and that's 45 minutes of questions, please use the chat box, and then I'll go through the questions, and that will make it a little bit easier for Josh than to manage the hands up function and things like that, especially when you have 30 guests. So that's the basic ground rules, everybody. Again, recorded session, muted and camera off. Question and answer period, we'll be using the chat box, okay? And I'll of course moderate the Q&A, and I'm very happy to do that. Now, just 2 minutes quickly. Josh, I met in the summer. Rather than read his bio, I'm just going to say a few things about him. And his bio is already on the website, and anybody can consult that. But Josh has come to U of T as a new person. I met him in the summer. We have a lot of shared interests because his work related particularly to interwar Italy aligns closely with some things I'm working on regarding interwar Albania. And Josh proved to be not just a quick, what you call fast friend, but a really, really great resource for me and some work I was doing regarding the relationship between King Zog of Albania and Benito Mussolini, of course. So he helped me out a lot, and I really appreciate that. And I think the University of Toronto is really lucky that someone like Josh has joined us. The area of focus that he brings to the university is something we really need. And as you probably already know, he's teaching at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. But we're bringing him in really actively into CERAS. So this is not just the first time you'll see him at a CERAS function. You're going to see him later on. In terms of his work, his interests include fascism and the far right, the politics of memory, monuments, and museums. Monuments will be, of course, a big part of today's discussion. Ideologies of race, empire, and the classical tradition, and everyday life in wartime and dictatorship. He is the author of Excavating Modernity, the Roman Past in Fascist Italy, and co-editor of Outside the State, the Politics of Everyday Life in Fascist Italy. Now, his current book project, 45 Days, Emotion, Experience, and Memory After Mussolini, is under contract, everybody, with Oxford University Press. And this book examines the popular responses to the collapse of the fascist regime in 1943. And last sentence I'll say about Josh, he's also written extensively on the he has also written extensively on the afterlives of fascist monuments in contemporary Italy and contested heritage in a global context. Josh, I'm turning over to you. We had hoped to be together in room 108 among friends, but let's consider this the first talk, and we'll be together in room 108 in 2022 sometime. So Josh, I'm handing over to you. Thank you, Josh. I'm going to clap now. I do clapping. You can raise your hand, do whatever you feel like.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I wanted to start with the image that Catherine Lukacs was kind enough to put on the poster. This is the image that you see on the screen now, and if I get in a little closer, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what you're looking at. This is a statue with the now known as the Genio dello Sport, or kind of genius of sport. It actually began life in 1939 as Il Genio del Fascismo, the spirit, the genius of fascism, in Rome's Aur district. This was the site of a planned but unrealized Universal Exposition to mark the Italian regime's 20th anniversary in 1942. Obviously, some certain events intervened, including a world war, and this occasion was never marked. But the district continued to be built after the war. And in 1953, the statue, which had already been erected, was edited. It had leather straps added to its saluting hand. We see that's why I've kind of zoomed in here on the hand here. And the inscription on the base was edited as well, from the genius of fascism to the genius of sport. And both of these changes are meant to recast the personification of fascist youthful vitality into a personification of athleticism. So how are we supposed to interpret this intervention? And the fact also that the statue kind of stands unmolested to this day. Scholars, and myself included, I've been writing, as Rob mentioned, about the afterlife of fascist monuments for over a decade. Scholars have variously interpreted this statue and other artifacts like it as physical manifestations of Italian ambivalence or evasiveness, of erasure, willful forgetting, a failure to come to terms with the fascist past, and even evidence, both kind of metaphorical but also physical, literal, of the persistence of fascistic currents and tendencies within Italian politics and society. Many, for example, voiced the concern that without some form of mediation, some explanatory panels, a documentary center, other measures, for example, that one encounters fairly regularly in Germany with monuments from the National Socialist period. Without these kinds of mediations, these monuments will be left to speak for themselves, and they'll transmit their originally intended message to an uninformed audience. Now, these are not only valid but valuable lines of interpretation, and I certainly hope so, given that they're lines on my CV, amongst other things. But at the same time, I think it's worth clarifying and refining the logic at work in these kind of arguments. Because of course, we know that physical structures and spaces, even politically fraught ones, never speak solely for themselves. Rather, people speak for them and through them. They exist not as unchanging expressions of their original context or the purposes for which they were originally produced, but rather as screens upon which ideologies and identities are projected in the present. As Svetlana Boym puts it, they're contexts for remembrances and debates about the future, not symbols of memory or nostalgia, not merely architectural metaphors, but projections of contested remembrances. Despite the illusion of fixity, they're subject to the movement of life. And correspondingly, controversies over what's often called difficult heritage stem less from the qualities inherent to a particular site or statue, and more from the shifting circumstances in which they exist, the meanings ascribed to them by agonistic actors, and the arguments for which they are conscripted. And so with this in mind, I think it's really essential to historicize both the survival of the fascist-built environment and contemporary controversies that surround them. As we'll see, there are very specific reasons why so many material traces of fascism remain, and then why, after long periods of invisibility, they periodically become visible and contested once more. And we're currently living through such a moment, which needs to be understood both within an Italian domestic context and a kind of larger global reckoning with difficult heritage. And I hope both I can touch on that and then also explore some of those comparisons more fully in our subsequent conversation. In particular right now, and this is sort of a new sort of framework that I'm trying to think about, I'm interested in understanding these debates through the lens of culture war. And this is a phrase, obviously, that is often thrown around, especially in American politics, but it is rarely defined. The term originally harkens back to the Kulturkampf, more accurately translated as cultural struggle or conflict in post-unification Germany. which was waged between the emergent German state and the Catholic Church over authority regarding education and marriage and burial rights, and other polarizing questions in which the values and practices of modern life were at stake. And this notion of a cultural conflict was then picked up in the 1990s. It's most closely associated with the sociologist James Davidson Hunter to describe a new bifurcation of American society over national symbols, over national symbols, education like textbooks and historical memories, language and multiculturalism, gender and sexuality, and so forth. And in this slide, you see both a discussion of the Kulturkampf and also Hunter's brief description of culture war, as well images depicting both the historical Kulturkampf with Bismarck facing off against Pope Pius IX, and then a more recent contest between, I guess for shorthand, what we now call red and blue America. And here I'd emphasize really that culture is conceived in terms of the underpinnings of group identity, even what Davidson calls a struggle to achieve or maintain the power to define reality, to order experience. I also want to kind of introduce and employ a related concept of cultural code, or another term we could also use is a shibboleth. This basically means a shorthand, a code that is legible to insiders. This concept comes from the work of Shulamit Volkov, and he was originally writing about sort of the culture of anti-Semitism in Germany prior to Nazism, and how it was used to express a whole host of anxieties about modern society, even when they had little or anything to do with Jews or like or dislike of Jews. That whether it was anxieties about capitalism or urbanization or communism, economic instability, all of these were refracted through the cultural code of anti-Semitism. We also have this kind of linguistic concept of a shibboleth, meaning a kind of linguistic password, a code, a shorthand that is used by one group to identify fellow group members, of indicating who's in and who's out. So to bridge these kind of two frameworks of, on the one hand, a culture war, and on the other hand, a cultural code, I want to think about a culture war as a conflict between competing cultural codes, between symbols that represent an entire complex of social, political, and moral norms. And I propose that these frameworks are useful vehicles for considering contemporary monument debates in Italy and beyond, as a way of understanding the dynamics of the contest, the stakes and the actors involved, and hopefully constructive ways of transcending what has become very much an entrenched debate that has shown little sign of movement. And so that's particularly at the end something I want to briefly reflect on, and that we can also talk about in the course of discussion. To start with, though, I want to spend a little time historicizing both the survival of fascist monuments in Italy, how they came down to us today, and then also consider the historical trajectory of the political landscape of contemporary Italy. Hopefully my slides are coming through all right. So why does fascist iconography continue to be so visible in cities and towns across Italy? To a significant degree, this is because of the trajectory of Mussolini's regime and the Second World War. Mussolini is removed from power by King Victor Emmanuel III on July 25th, 1943. And the following day, July 26th, sees a wave of popular iconoclasm across Italy, targeting images of the Duce, fasci, the Fasces symbol, and other emblems. And as Rob mentioned, I happen to be writing a book about this particular moment, the immediate aftermath of the fascist regime right now. And I can speak to this moment, this historical moment, more if you like. This particular kind of iconoclastic window proves to be extremely short-lived. In some places, it only lasts for a few hours. Italy is still at war with the Allies, and the military authorities who take over from Mussolini fear a revolutionary situation. And so demonstrations are repressed. People are arrested for vandalism and looting. Hundreds are even shot in the streets by Italian troops. And then 6 weeks later, Italy surrenders to the Allies, and the country is divided between a Nazi-occupied north and an Anglo-American occupied south. And the war in Italy persists for another 18 months. Now, as the Allies fight northward, they often occupy infrastructure that is built by and for the fascist party. And we see a couple of examples of that here in the top right corner. We see Allied troops outside of Mussolini's offices in Piazza Venezia in Rome, his sort of famous balcony where he would address the nation on major occasions. The Allied occupational authorities, the military government, actually even moves into these offices. Or similarly, as we'll be talking about a little more today, the fascist youth headquarters in Rome, it turns into a rest center for GIs. And the Allied forces and authorities never really undertake a comprehensive program of visual or a material defascistization comparable to what they would later do in Germany. And then post-war Italian governments, focused really largely on rebuilding infrastructure, don't pursue this either. So that the task of kind of symbolic defascistization is left to local communities who essentially, by and large, do nothing. And the result is that it's very common across Italy to encounter traces of the fascist era. Some are grand and monumental. Here we see the famous Mussolini obelisk in Rome. Are we returning to that particular site? As well as a monument to victory in Brescia in northern Italy, and then the Re di Puglia monument, which was a World War I memorial built by the regime in the late 1930s that still kind of has its original appearance. This very much points to sort of the monopolization of World War I memory by the fascist regime. And so most World War I memorials in Italy continue to be sort of filtered through a particular fascist narrative of that conflict. So some traces are monumental like this. Others are architectural and are hailed as masterworks of interwar rationalist architecture by major architects of the day. We see that, for example, in the Fascist Party headquarters in Como, and the church in Sabaudia, which was a new town built by the regime, and the original Fascist Party headquarters in Milan. So often architectural spaces have become kind of monumentalized themselves. Some traces are much more quotidian. Here I'm thinking of kind of the ubiquitous wall stencils that the regime would put up with slogans from Mussolini, right? Believe, obey, fight, to us. Or even something small like fasci that decorate buildings and manhole covers, which you can still readily encounter. And then one also encounters some kind of traces that, should we say, are conspicuous by their absence, that might have been chiseled away or erased during that brief iconoclastic window in 1943. And that still kind of clearly, everyone kind of clearly recognizes, or Italians certainly clearly recognize what they originally contained. This image here from Trento is now referred to by locals as La Donna del Flitto, or the woman carrying the insecticide kind of dispenser, a kind of joke for kind of her body language, which once carried a fascio. This one is also interesting. This is on the Janiculum Hill in Rome, and the name Duce and Mussolini was erased, but periodically someone comes by to fill it in with a pen. So when we think about kind of how fascist monuments survived. A lot of it has to do with the trajectory of the war and then sort of different priorities in post-war Italy. And as I'll kind of return to, in many ways, these monuments kind of remained invisible or uncontested for decades after the war, until they would become kind of objects of controversy again. Now, just as we've thought about the kind of trajectory of fascist monuments, I now also want to think about, in kind of the physical landscape, I now want to think about the Italian political landscape and how that was fundamentally structured by the events of the fascist era and the Second World War. The only group to emerge from the Second World War in Italy with political legitimacy was the Italian fascist the anti-fascist resistance, which itself was composed of many different ideological factions, including socialists, Catholics, even monarchists, but was really dominated by communists. And so the communists emerged from the Second World War with a kind of legitimacy of having spearheaded the anti-fascist resistance. And while the emerging Cold War order means that the Italian Communist Party is permanently excluded from power in Italy in the post-war decades, the party still maintains a strong foothold in the Italian political landscape, typically commanding sort of between 20 and 30% of the vote. Again, largely on the basis of claiming the mantle of resistentialism, that it was the truest expression of the struggle against fascism and on behalf of democracy. And this continues throughout the post-war decades. We see this, for example, in the embrace of April 25th, National Liberation Day is a holiday that sort of is really kind of the property of the left in Italy. On the right, Italy is the first country to see the emergence of a neo-fascist party, the Movimento Sociale Italiano, or Italian Social Movement. Now, anti-fascist legislation after the war means that this movement cannot use the symbols and vocabulary of historical fascism, but it identifies explicitly with the Italian Social Republic, which was Mussolini's Nazi puppet regime in northern Italy in the latter stages of the war. And for die-hard fascists, this, after the war, is sort of seen as the truest expression of fascism's revolutionary potential. And the MSI, the Italian Social Movement, positions itself, as you can see in this poster here, both against the left, here we see the PCI, the communists, as well as effectively the center, the Christian Democrats, who dominate Italian politics in the Cold War era. This poster here points to the claiming not only of Italian patriotism through the use of the tricolor, but for those who could read it, also the banners of the old Italian monarchy, which was suppressed after 1946, and of the Italian Social Republic, again, that kind of fascist rump republic in northern Italy. So I think, one last point about the social movement is that it essentially, while it is a kind of sort of an important presence in the political landscape, it remains always kind of at the fringes, on the sort of border, the boundary between legitimacy and illegitimacy, really at the fringes, and its vote share typically hovers around somewhere around 5% nationally. Only on one occasion is it brought very briefly into a governing coalition, and the protests that unleashes are so virulent that that coalition falls apart almost immediately. So both, the larger point here is that both the Italian left and right explicitly define themselves and their opponents in relation to the politics of the preceding era, and that the schism between them ultimately is less about economics or foreign policy, but it's really a schism to do with cultural code, with divided memories of the fascist era and the war. This is a culture war that characterizes the split between left and right. Furthermore, it's important to note that both sides are effectively excluded from power in the post-war decades. The communists because they're on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, and the MSI because it is identified still with fascism in the minds of most Italian voters and constantly kind of tarred with that brush by its opponents. Now, the end of the Cold War fundamentally shifts the Italian political landscape, both because it sees the end of the bipolar political logic that was governing European, indeed global politics, that had, for example, left the Christian Democrats effectively in power for the entire post-war period, but also because it exposes in Italy widespread corruption amongst the parties that were sort of entrenched in power as a result of the Cold War dynamic. And in addition, specifically for the Communist Party, it creates the problem that the collapse of the Soviet Union makes communism a really tough brand to sell. It makes it impossible for the left to identify with communism anymore. And so what you're seeing in this image are sort of series of rebrands over the course of the 1990s, in which the Communist Party kind of redefines itself over a series of iterations, not as a communist party, but increasingly as a kind of center-left party, even really a neoliberal center-left party, not dissimilar, for example, from Tony Blair's New Labour. And we can even see that in iconographic terms, that whereas the first post-communist party, the Democratic Party of the Left, still maintains the old PCI emblem in its logo, that is sort of progressively jettisoned. First, it's replaced by the rose, kind of a symbol of European social democracy, and then eventually by an olive tree, an olive branch. First, because the Democrats of the left align themselves in a multi-party coalition calling itself the Olive Tree, and then that same symbol is carried over into the Democratic Party, which is its current configuration, has been since 2007, which again uses that very uncommunist symbol of the olive tree. The use of terminology that is reminiscent of the American Democratic Party is also not accidental. This is very much the rebrand that the architects of the Democratic Party were aiming at. The lone exception is the Communist Refoundation Party, a kind of a fringe group of a breakaway group of kind of unreconstructed communists that rejects this migration to the center. So what does this mean in terms of the identity of the Italian left and its cultural code? Really what we see, and this is something traced recently in the work of the historian Phil Cook, is that the contemporary center left still occasionally plays lip service to its historical foundations in anti-fascist resistance, but that often this adherence, in his words, is more ritual than real, that it is periodically revived to keep the left on board, but it's no longer organic or cohesive. And then we see similar patterns with some important variations on the right as well, that the end of the Cold War presents an opportunity for the right, in the form of the Italian social movement, to emerge out of the fringes and the sort of semi-legitimacy it had been sitting in. And this new generation of leadership rebrands the Italian social movement as a mainstream conservative party, the National Alliance. And here we see that it has maintained the old MSI logo. This National Alliance, headed by Gianfranco Fini, presents itself as a kind of conservative and nationalist formation, but one that has very much claims to distance itself from its fascist past. Indeed, the National Alliance migrates into a coalition government with Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia, a party that really didn't fit into the conventional political landscape of post-war Italy, is really kind of more libertarian in orientation. And they together formed this very not fascist looking People of Liberty or People of Freedom Party, which lasts until 2013, at which point the right fractures again. And those kind of post-fascists of National Alliance form a more right-wing party called the Brothers of Italy. At the same time, they also see new competition from new formations. One of the most significant, probably the most significant, is the Lega, which originally starts life as the Northern League, a kind of northern autonomist or even separatist party, but which increasingly becomes national in scope and also increasingly ever more kind of xenophobic and illiberal, particularly under its current leader, Matteo Salvini, who rebrands it as simply the League in 2018. While the Lega remains the kind of furthest right of the, should we say, mainstream parties, there is also particularly starting in the 2010s, a resurgence of far-right groups that identify even more explicitly with the fascist legacy, that double down on fascist iconography and sort of paramilitary tactics and violence and rhetoric, because they reject the movement of the right into the mainstream. And this is certainly the case with groups like Casa Pound, who you see in the bottom left here. Even the name itself is a historical reference to Ezra Pound, the poet who famously was fascinated with fascism and moved to Mussolini's Italy. So for the parties, the kind of principal parliamentary parties of the right, the challenge becomes sort of a double game of, on the one hand, distancing themselves from the legacies of fascism, preventing the fascist label from being applied to them, escaping the bounds of illegitimacy, while at the same time trying to keep up with more radical presences on the far right to attract their voters and not allow them to be outflanked by groups like Casa Pound and Forza Nuova and so on. So what we're seeing again on both the left and the right is that they're confronted with this kind of constantly shifting political landscape, and that changing exigencies force them to adapt and distance themselves further and further from the cultural codes of fascism or anti-fascism that had expressed their core identities and that still appealed to their kind of core bases of support. Now, what does this all have to do with monuments? Well, it's effectively what I'd like to propose is that sort of monument controversies become a key venue in which these tensions play out. And significantly, these controversies really have come to the fore most fully only in the last 5 or so years, roughly since 2015. Not uncoincidentally, more or less contemporaneous with reckonings that we've seen around the world, which, at least in the United States, really began with the white supremacist attack on an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, which then ushered in a whole new set of debates about Confederate monuments in the southern US. It was that backdrop which ultimately led to the events in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then this also kind of has a global valence in subsequent years, obviously in accelerating with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd, and then kind of connecting with international movements to confront the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and white supremacy. In Italy, one of the most high-profile clashes in this process also occurred in 2015, when Laura Boldrini, and that's this woman down here, who was the president of the Chamber of Deputies for the Democratic Party, and very much a kind of mainstream centrist figure, met, and this is the occasion that is being shown here, met with a group of elderly partisans, anti-fascist resistance fighters, to celebrate Liberation Day on April 25th, 2015. And in the course of the meet and greet with these partisans, she was caught on camera agreeing that the name Mussolini should be erased from this obelisk here in Rome, in the Foro Italico in Rome. This was built as the headquarters of the fascist youth organization and chief kind of athletic complex for the regime. It includes not only a 120-foot high obelisk that says Mussolini Dux or Duce, but also mosaics showing things like the fascist invasion of Ethiopia, young people saluting and chanting Duce, and plaques or monoliths showing key achievements, quote unquote, of the fascist regime, in this case, the conquest of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. When Boldrini says to the elderly partisans, yes, it would be a good idea to erase Mussolini's name from the obelisk, this causes a massive outcry. Protests from right-wing parties and cultural commentators, as well as other historical preservationists and sort of others who object to it on grounds other than pure politics. For advocates of removal, the problem with fascist monuments is that they function as contaminants. These images you see here are taken from the base of that same obelisk, and they are placards and flowers placed by far-right groups to sort of as commemorations or tributes to Mussolini. The one on the left says, sort of, history showed that you were right, proved that you were right, and the comrades honor you, render honor unto you. And so, as you see from this, these were the remarks of this elderly partisan who was calling on Boldrini to erase the name Mussolini. He says, I think you should do something to cleanse all Italy's streets of fascism, which is coming back. That, confronted with the reemergence of radical right forces, the monuments are seen as kind of conduits of the kind of original bacillus of fascism, which now poses an illegitimate and existential threat to democracy. Indeed, it had never gone away. It had somehow been conserved within the material culture of the monument itself. This obviously is an argument that kind of involves the collapsing of temporal distance between the past and the present, that the monuments make the ideology that built them present once more. And this helps sort of on the left serve as a kind of maintenance of the cultural code of anti-fascism, of signaling to supporters that by seeking to remove the traces of fascism, the Democratic Party is not abandoning the heritage of the resistance. Now, it should be noted that many voices, even within the Democratic Party, pushed back against this notion, and ultimately the government did nothing about removing this text. So on the left, then, the kind of cultural argument is that fascist monuments are contaminants. On the right, we see a different set of rhetorical strategies. One key one is that even though these are largely far-right groups and right-wing parties who are mobilizing opposition to this supposed cleansing of monuments, they advance what they claim is a depoliticized agenda, namely that fascism is historical patrimony or heritage to protect. In many instances, they take advantage of the kind of classicism of many fascist monuments to suggest that these are not fascist monuments, but rather Italian or Roman monuments that fit into the built environment of Italy in the same way as ancient monuments or any other layer of history that abounds in so many Italian cities. It also allows those who oppose the removal or editing of monuments to frame the other side as iconoclasts. Often in the debate over the fate of this monument, the right would accuse Boldrini and others of being like the Taliban, which had destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas, a decade or so earlier. That they possessed no historical awareness, that they had no cultural sensibility, and it allows the right to turn the tables on accusations of fascism and authoritarianism by accusing the left of being enemies of pluralism, of seeking to erase all physical traces of the opposition. Here, it's not coincidental that while this monuments controversy was happening, the main issues being debated in Parliament were gay adoption and citizenship for the children of immigrants who had been born in Italy, the so-called Jus Soli law. In both cases, the right tried to kind of bundle all these together to suggest that the left was undertaking a program of radical social change. In some cases, this even kind of connected to what we now recognize as sort of a discourse around a great replacement, that even on a physical material level, the traces of the opposition of the other side would be erased and replaced with new monuments to this kind of multicultural order that the left was accused of promoting. And so the right organizes what it calls selfie bomb campaigns, where it tells people to go to the obelisk and pose in front of the monument, as this far right group is doing here. Just take one sip of water. Now, equally, fascist material culture is defended by these groups, not just because of its historicity and its sort of patrimonial value, but also because of its modernity. The argument for many defenders of fascist material culture is that fascism, Mussolini's regime, represented the era of modernization in Italy, and that much of public infrastructure in Italy, modern public infrastructure, and indeed other modern institutions, was a fascist creation. As this quotation, I won't read it out for you in full, from a senator for the National Alliance suggests, fascism did things in a short time that have not been realized since. Fascism brought about growth for the entire country. It left an indelible mark on our history. And he enumerates all the different architectural and urban planning achievements and sort of social reforms undertaken by the regime. By making this argument about sort of fascism as a modernizing force and assigning that function to material culture, defenders of kind of fascist memory are able to insert themselves within the bounds of legitimacy, that the fascist label, they're hoping, will be reframed so that it's no longer outside of the bounds of democracy, but rather has been reintegrated into the span of Italian history as a modernizing force. And at the same time, with these arguments about heritage and modernity, the right can signal to supporters that they're not abandoning their political lineage, that they are keeping on board the legacies of historical fascism. And this prevents them from being outflanked to the right by some of these even more radical far-right groups. Because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion, I want to finish by suggesting a couple of conclusions that we can reflect upon, also just keeping an eye on the time, about sort of, particularly with your input, how we can consider this way of thinking in terms of applying it to other cases, and what scholars, historians, and others can do to contribute to these debates. The first issue I'd stress is that we need to pay attention to contingency. That very often these debates are reduced to debates about the history originally represented in these monuments. In other words, that this is ultimately a debate about events that occurred in the 1930s and 40s, about the fascist past itself. I think it's important for historians like me, who spend all our time thinking about the past, to remember that we're also kind of, geographers of time. We need to recognize when there are novelties and discontinuities as well as continuities with the past. And that, as I've tried to suggest here, many of these debates really are about contemporary Italian politics and society, and about a cultural divide within political poles today, both between the two poles and within the two poles. And that this can help us sort of resist reifying the very kind of mythic narratives that the promoters of, let's say, fascist memory would like to promote. That we can point out the ways in which contested symbols, far from being relics that have been transmitted intact from the past, assume new meanings over time and live in the contemporary world. Second, I think we can pay attention, as I tried to suggest, to cultural codes, to examining rhetorical strategies, to reflect on who is signaling what to whom. What are people saying when they talk about monuments? What are they really saying? And that, as we've seen in this instance, often what's being expressed here has less to do with fascism and anti-fascism and more about the contemporary political landscape of Italy and the kind of alignment of electoral parties. And then the third would be to sort of challenge a zero-sum logic that is often at work in these debates, a kind of Manichaean logic, and to advance instead the idea, and this is from the theorist Michael Rothberg, that memories be multi-directional, that memories are subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, that they're productive, not privative. So I've moved through a lot of material here, but I hope that this can be a kind of jumping off point for further discussion. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, and I'll turn it over to Rob.
Josh, thanks very much. We've got